everybody, and welcome to this new series of Thinking About talks for 2021. I'm Dr. Joe Spence. I'm the Master at Dulwich College, but also in my capacity as co-director of the Southwark Schools Learning Partnership. I'm really delighted to be introducing tonight's talk and this new series. The Southwark Schools Learning Partnership loves bringing together students, teachers, schools, and that's what we're doing tonight again. Through the last two lockdowns, Thinking About became really something quite special, I think, for our schools and united us as equals in a real democratization of everything that can go on when you're on screen together, sharing ideas, sharing questions. What we loved finding is that very often people who maybe were more wary of asking questions in big public fora actually used that chat function, as you can tonight, and ask questions of our guests. We love the fact that this series is about the pupils. I've just come from another meeting, indeed shared with one of your pupil leaders tonight, talking about the power of pupil voice, how much we need to trust our pupils to take a lead on the issues that really matter. And that's what we're doing through this Thinking About series. I don't think it's any accident in the time that we're living in that the first three talks this term almost seem as if they're joined by a theme, and the theme is the theme of community and the need for communities to show that they can live together in spite of differences. You'll hear at the end that next week we'll be talking about identity, and the week after that about kindness. But we start with a very serious topic, but a topic where, in a sense, however dark it is, what our speaker tonight will show is that you can bring light into that darkness. You can make a difference if you commit your life, your thought, your work to a cause. And the cause that Dr. James Smith has committed so much of his professional life and personal time to is that of Holocaust education and making a difference in every way he can. James's first work in this space was the setting up of the UK's National Holocaust Centre with his brother and parents. And then 21 years ago, he set up the organization whose work we'll hear about tonight, Aegis Trust, an organization that is dedicated to the prevention of genocide and to the reconciliation of communities that have been affected by it. When we think of genocide, we tend to think back to the Nazi Holocaust, and we tend to think that never would anything like that happen again. And yet James's experience, of course, is that things have happened since the 1940s, 80 years on. We can't say that it was a case of never again. We can say it's a case now of make sure we never forget, make sure we learn from the past and make a difference in the future and do prevent things happening again as they have over that period in places that James will tell you more about tonight. Our own association with Dr. James Smith has already found us wonderful partners and friends elsewhere. James brought to our attention a charity I hope that all the schools of the Southwark Schools Learning Partnership will be working with in 2021 or 22 or soon thereafter, and that's Echo Eternal. Echo Eternal is a charity that, as its name suggests, believes that we need to echo testimonies from Holocaust survivors and let young people learn from them and respond to them artistically. We've done that this year, and in fact, at 6 o'clock tonight, it so happens, what we've done with them goes live. I commend that to you, and I hope that you'll look to find out more about it, because we would love all the schools of the Southwark Schools Learning Partnership to combine in that sort of work for the future. But my absolute pleasure now to introduce to you Dr. James Smith. He's going to talk for about 20 minutes on the theme of thinking about genocide, genocides. And then I'm delighted that we have Ore from JAGS and Amjad and Matt from Dulwich College to ask them questions. They have their own questions that they'll lead on, but then thereafter, please do make sure that you feed questions through, and we'll look to answer as many as we can in the next hour. But James, welcome to the SSLP. Welcome to the Thinking About series. It's a delight to have you with us.
Thank you, Joe. It's a delight to be with you all. You're 10 years old. It's a war zone, and you're fleeing along a road with your few belongings. with your family, thousands upon thousands of people, and you hear a baby crying. You go to investigate, and there on the side of the road, there is a massacre. A family has been killed, and among the family, hanging on to its mother's breast, is a little baby. And the mother catches your eye in her last breath, pleading with you to take her baby. She can't talk because of the injury she's got to her neck from machete wounds. But you know she's pleading, save my baby. And you're looking at the baby, and you turn around and see your family, and your family are there. Your grandma is telling you to leave it. Leave the cockroach, she says, referring to the baby. Because if you pick it up, you'll put your own life in danger. The people that did this are still around, and they don't want you to save babies like this. You not only put your own life in danger, but you put our lives in danger, your own grandmother's life. And what are you going to do as a 10-year-old? Your gut instinct is you want to save the baby, but your family's telling you you're going to put them all in jeopardy. What will you do? Hold that thought, because we're going to come back to that in about 15 minutes. But first of all, I just want to share a little bit with you why it is and how it is that our family, who's not a Jewish family, came to set up the National Holocaust Memorial and Museum, which is up in Nottinghamshire, and I hope some of you will have the opportunity to visit there one day. We'd paid a visit to Israel. My brother was doing some studies there as part of his PhD, and we went to a memorial museum, and we're just absolutely blown away by learning that 6 million Jews had been murdered during the Second World War. Of course, we kind of knew that in one level. We'd all heard about it, but it wasn't taught at schools in those days. I was a medical student just about to graduate, actually, from Leeds University, and something caught my eye in that museum, and that was that 45% of doctors had joined the Nazi Physicians League. So that's nearly half of the doctors in Germany. Now, quite clearly, half of the doctors couldn't have been psychopaths or rabid anti-Semites. There were different reasons why they joined the Nazi Physicians League, different reasons why they and their profession had come to legitimize this act of mass murder, extermination that the Nazis undertook during the Second World War. Indeed, the doctors did legitimize it. They were very much involved, not only in the sort of medical experiments that you hear about in the camps, but also the whole concept and idea of improving the race of a nation, which is what the whole Nazi philosophy was about. Was underpinned by scientists, underpinned by doctors. They had sterilization programs, forced sterilization programs to stop people having children who they thought were in one way or another diminishing the sort of racial purity. These were people with illnesses, mental health illnesses, schizophrenia, even epilepsy, and all sorts of conditions that were thought to be hereditary. 300,000 people were sterilized between 1933 and 1939. It was the doctors that first started killing people with gas. It wasn't Jewish people in concentration camps, but it was people with severe, what we would describe today as severe learning disabilities, and they were kept in sort of institutions of sort of long care institutions. There was an order to destroy what was that they were defined as or described as life unworthy of life, or useless eaters, because the state was having to support them. And when that policy was passed down, nearly every institution where people with severe learning disabilities were kept were in one way or another killed by the same people that had previously been caring for them. It had been undertaken by lethal injection to start with, and the doctors then devised what they thought was a more swift way to deal with this, and that was to develop these hermetically sealed places with that they would pump carbon monoxide into from engines. So that brings me back to standing there thinking, well, how on earth did doctors get involved in all of this? So many doctors. This wasn't just a handful of as I say, psychopaths. It made me realize that, me being no different to anyone else, there was a probably 50% chance of me becoming involved in the Nazi Physicians League for one reason or another, because there's different reasons, personal reasons, perhaps why people got involved in these things. So my brother and myself came back from that trip, and we decided to set up what became the National Holocaust Centre. It was a much smaller project than that to start with. But I'm just going to share my screen and show you, I think, some photographs of the centre. This is the centre that was set up in 1995. Just another view of it. This big building here was the house that our family lived in. It was the countryside. My parents were church people. My father was a minister in the Methodist Church, actually, and they had what was called a retreat centre there for people from different denominations, and they kindly let us take it over. There's memorial gardens where survivors could plant roses in memory of their families that were perished in the Holocaust, because we realized that many survivors living in this country didn't have anywhere that they could go and remember their own loved ones. This is some of the family of survivors when we first opened in 1995. You'll see it's quite a rural location in Nottinghamshire. Many of these survivors have sadly passed away now. The centre, as I say, opened in 1995. It's over 25 years ago. But many of these individuals that experienced firsthand the experience and survival under the Nazis would come and share their stories with young people at the centre on a daily basis, and that still goes on. But they're with us in ever diminishing numbers. In fact, this past 12 months alone, 9 of our survivor family have passed away. Most recently, someone called Bernard Grunberg, who came over on what's called the children's the Kinder transport, the children's transports, and he only passed away just last week, and he'd been speaking every week at the centre for the past 2 decades. But while we were building the centre, this was intended as this museum as a warning from history that if genocide could happen in Europe in the 1930s and 40s, can we be sure that genocide is not going to happen again to somebody else and somewhere else? And what must we do to learn the warning signs? And yet we'd hardly completed building the centre. We hadn't even opened it when Bosnian Muslims were being shot into mass graves in 1995, July 1995. So this is now when I was an adult. I was no longer, I could look back at my parents' or my grandparents' generation and say, well, what on earth was going on here? And why didn't we respond more effectively? To my shame, we didn't know really how to respond, despite us having looked back at the Holocaust and saying, never again, because these statements like never again, if we don't give serious thought to them, are nothing but empty slogans. We have to start to dig deep, and that's why I'm so pleased that we've got the chance to think deeply about these issues today, and that you've all joined to ask me some questions as well, and share your thoughts. So the in 1999, this is 4 years after we opened the centre, the crisis in Kosovo happened. This is a picture of some Kosovan Albanians they were not actually in a concentration camp. It happened to be through a wire that I visited as a volunteer doctor with an aid agency called International Medical Corps. This was in 1999. And the former Yugoslavia was falling apart, and this was just the latest stage in ethnic cleansing, people being targeted because of their ethnicity or their religion, and around 1 million people were displaced in that crisis. And it was this situation here in Kosovo that led me to think about why are we always responding so late? I was responding with an aid agency, part of the humanitarian effort, and of course that's really important to keep people alive. But in talking to the refugees, it was clear that they knew something was going to happen many months before it actually did. And if they knew that something awful was going to happen, why couldn't that be translated to some sort of knowledge whereby we could get earlier interventions to prevent these kind of tragedies in the first place? Just want to go back a few years though. This was 1999, but if I can just go back to 1994, there was a unimaginable situation occurred right in the middle of Africa, in a tiny country called Rwanda. At the time, less than 10 million population, one of the poorest countries in the world. And it seemed to take everybody by surprise that there was a civil war that had broken out, supposedly a civil war. That's how it had been portrayed in our media, and that civilians were being caught in the crossfire. But it turned out that there was a long history, run-up of some 3 or 4 decades of the Tutsi population being targeted, being stereotyped, myths propagated in the media about them, isolation in schools where Tutsis were told to sit at the back of the class, and where there were quotas for university. And there was a lot of fear being stirred up in the media. And eventually, in 1994, around 1 million Tutsi were murdered in the space of 3 months. And now that was faster than the Nazis were operating their death camps. It was, and most of this killing was done by machete. And this was a huge challenge to us, as individuals that had been creating a warning from history. I just want to, I'm going to come back to Rwanda in a moment. I just want to show you this, this picture. Some of you may recognize him. For those of you who don't, his name is Raphael Lemkin. Raphael Lemkin was a lawyer, actually a Jewish lawyer that lived in the eastern part of Poland. And he'd become concerned way before the Holocaust and the Nazis about this crime in which states were able to identify groups of people and kill them on this massive scale, and then there'd be no accountability for that. And his question was, how is it if one person, he was actually referring to the treatments of the Armenians in the First World War by the Ottoman, the crumbling Ottoman Empire, in which 1.5 million or so Armenians were killed. And he said, how is it that if one person commits a crime of murder, they will be put on trial, but if a state kills 1 million people deliberately without intent to kill them because of their identity, that there is no recourse, and that quite literally it's possible to get away with murder. So he eventually coined the term genocide. And to try and understand this, understand the concepts that Raphael Lemkin was describing, it wasn't simply about mass murder. It wasn't about exterminating. Of course, that can be what happens in genocide, as happened in Rwanda and as happened in to Jews and to other groups under the Nazis. What Lemkin understood is that genocide is a process. It's not an all or none event. That it can happen slowly, and it can happen by targeting people. If you like, it wasn't his words, but my words are that genocide is a process of exclusion in which a group is identified because of their ethnicity, their religion, their race, as he described it, and their language may be attacked, their culture may be attacked. Now, this definition didn't actually end up in international law, but this is how he was describing it. But what did end up in international law was that genocide can be about killing members of the group, but it could be about forcible sterilization. It could be by preventing births, even removing children away from their parents, as happened in Australia under British instigation of indigenous peoples. It may be about depriving people of food. So when we see people starving in different parts of the world, we should always ask the question, are people starving because somebody wants them to starve? So, so that's Raphael Lemkin. He's the one that gave us the term genocide, and 3 years after the Second World War, it was enshrined in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. I just want to quickly nip back to this picture here. This picture, sorry, it's not very good resolution, but it's actually in a memorial in Rwanda. After Aegis Trust was established following the Kosovo crisis in 2000, the government of Rwanda asked Aegis if we would help to develop some of their own memorials to the victims of the genocide. And we have been working there now for the past 20 years almost, in Rwanda, helping to develop the national memorial where different programs are run. You'll see here, this is an amphitheatre at the memorial where there's all sorts of programs. This is an artistic program, a theatrical program that takes place every year next to the memorial. But I've not put pictures of this, but next to this this amphitheatre, there is a burial place of around 250,000 victims of the genocide against the Tutsi in 1994. Very briefly, because we're going to be talking about this soon, one of the approaches of Aegis Trust was to say, well, genocide is such a huge event. How do we even begin to think about preventing it? And this is why we approached it in the way that public health would approach the prevention of diseases, that to break it down to these different stages, and that when we often think about genocide prevention, we're thinking about, sending in a military intervention, an army to protect people. But in a way, that's a failure of prevention. That's when it's got too late. And in this scheme, we would say that secondary prevention, that we're trying to prevent atrocities from escalating and from causing more harm. What Aegis Trusts focus on is primary prevention, in addressing the whole community and looking at risk factors that can prevent atrocities occurring in the first place. And I'll come back to more on that soon. Tertiary prevention is just recognizing that, after an event, after there's been atrocities, that there are still consequences, mental health consequences, for example, a poverty where people's houses have been destroyed, where we can still help and the lives of survivors to be rebuilt. So even if there's been a failure of primary and secondary prevention, there's no excuse for the international community and ourselves to neglect the survivors. Very briefly, you don't need to look at all these words on here. All I'm showing you this is to say that in our education programs in places like Rwanda, we look at what we call the pathways to violence and the pathways to peace. In other words, if you look at the red arrow, that's all you need to look at on there. at the bottom of the arrow would be when atrocities or genocide is taking place. But before that, there might be 10 different stages and steps where there's opportunities for us to think about changing behaviors, changing our own behaviors that can help to protect our own communities from sliding into violence. And likewise, the opposite way is a pathway to peace, which might include greater acceptance of others and building empathy and developing a community spirit, which Joe spoke about right at the beginning of this call. These programs are this is part of an education program, education for prevention. The government of Rwanda asked Aegis Trust if we would help to develop these programs at the memorial, which have now been included into the national curriculum. So that means it's everybody in the country is involved in these programs, and the idea is to break down the barriers. You imagine living in a country where 1 million people have been murdered. You imagine how divided our country is after Brexit. Just imagine if 10% of the country had been murdered, including many of your family or people who had family that were involved in those atrocities. How do you rebuild after that? How do even the second generation begin to come together? And so this is the purpose of the peace education program. And why is this so important to prevention? It's partly about rebuilding, but it is also about prevention because what we know is that genocide and atrocities are more likely to happen in countries where it's already happened, and that's why we continue to work in places like Rwanda to help rebuild. And this comes back to the story that I said right at the very beginning of thinking about yourself as a 10-year-old girl, because around these stories as well, it's not just about content and lots of words like we've got on the page here. In Rwanda, the team decided that the best way to convey some of these difficult concepts and bring people together that don't trust each other is through storytelling. And that comes back to this story of Grace, who was a 10-year-old girl. She was a Hutu girl that was going with her family at the end of the genocide in 1994. There also was a civil war going on, and they were fleeing because many Hutu thought that the incoming rebel army that eventually took control of Rwanda would have reprisals upon them. It was Grace, this 10-year-old girl, that heard the baby crying. She was in this dilemma: do I rescue the baby, or do I do what my grandmother has told me and leave the cockroach there, because you'd put us all in danger? Cockroach was what the radical Hutu government referred to Tutsis as. They were sort of a minority group in Rwanda. Now, I did ask you to think, what might you do? And there wasn't really a right or wrong answer. I think if Grace had walked away, she was saving her family from danger. If she picked the baby up, she was also doing something incredibly courageous. And that is exactly what she did. This is a real story, by the way. It's told in a graphic form on exhibitions that travel around the country and in schools and through their books. But these were real stories of real people that did incredible, courageous things. And the purpose of telling these stories is about three things. It's about what did Grace have that the militia didn't have, who massacred this family and who wanted to kill this baby. And the first is that she'd got some empathy. She heard the baby crying, and she didn't think of it as a cockroach, as a rodent, or as vermin. She heard a human baby and realized that human baby was no different from herself. And so this is about empathy. The second thing is that when she was told and she'd heard about somebody that was a threat, or a group that indeed were vermin, she thought for herself and thought, well, that doesn't seem right. I can see with my own eyes, hear with my own ears, and I shall make my own mind up. And that's something that we all have to do when we're bombarded on social media and in the mainstream media about who is right, who is wrong, who we should fear. who's taking our jobs and so on. We've got to start to think for ourselves, just as Grace did in rescuing his baby. And the third point about this story is that it's about responsibility, individual responsibility, not waiting for the United Nations or the government or somebody else or the school, whoever it is, to come and do something. But we can all take actions, and we don't need to risk our lives to make a situation better. We're not in a situation like Grace is, but we can all think about ways in which we can make a difference in our own community. I'm going to stop there. There may be some questions, and got other things I'm sure we can share later on. But I'm conscious I spoke more than the 20 minutes that I said I would do.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. I think everyone here definitely has gained a different perspective when it comes to preventing and dealing with such events. We're going to move on to questions. So myself, Amjad and Ore will go through our own questions as well as the audience's, and we'll just keep going through it and see how many we can get through. I guess my first question is, do you consider it possible for nations or ethnic groups to become completely rid of, or at least to control, these prejudice beliefs?
Prejudice is just everywhere, in every community. It seems to have been, happened in every continent, every nation, in every time. And so you're right that what we're dealing with is something that's innate. It's something that's within us, something that we seem to be able to, or it seems to be able to be ignited very easily. Can it be overcome? Then yes, it can, but it needs real intent to overcome it. And that's why I think we need to be talking about these issues more than we do. And that's why I think the whole global conversation around race and identity, and it ties in with what's going to happen next week as well with the conversation about identity that you'll be having with David Lammy. We've got to have these conversations, and we've got to reach far back and try and understand why it is we have this inequality, inequity, these differences, and these fears, and that's something that we is hugely important. To prevent communities from sliding down to violence, we've got to recognize that what drives a lot of that is fear. Fear is currency for media. Fear is currency for politicians that want to manipulate communities. And the only way in which we build resilience against that is for us to know it and to recognize it, and also to deal with the past. And that's one of and what gives me some hope is actually that story you saw in a graphic format of Grace. But of course, today she's now, in her 30s. The little baby she rescued lives with her. Her name's Vanessa. She's graduated, she's at university now. And they live together as mother and daughter, or mother and daughter sister relationship. And of course, they're across the ethnic divide. And, they've overcome it despite all the pressures on them. And, I've seen many people, our executive director of Aegis Trust in Rwanda, who I hope you may have the chance to hear one day if he's in the UK, but could perhaps come and talk to you. He lost 80 members of his family, including his 4 sisters and both of his parents during the genocide. And he's forgiven the people that did this. Why? Because he knows it's the only way his children are going to live in safety. And so what I'm thinking is, if they can overcome this and deal with the hatred and the prejudices and everything else, and deal with the long history, then we all ought to be able to do that ourselves also. But it takes a lot of effort, and sometimes it's very difficult.
Thank you. Move on to Ore, who's going to ask the next question.
Yeah. So from looking at your website, you talked about how students should aim to help strengthen their school's resistance to prejudice. How do you advise young people to go about this in a manner that will result in lasting change?
Yeah, well, it's different in different parts of the world. We've spoken about Rwanda, but I think we can also talk about our own countries. and there's got to be, in every school, there's going to be instances of prejudice and racism against different people, not only because of race and for other reasons. And I think, first of all, whenever we hear it and see it, we've got to call it out among our peer group, even if it's inferred, implied. There's got to be zero tolerance for it. And that, we're the ones that hear it. It's not somebody, there's no police around that are hearing, it's us. And we've got to start, really being clear that if there's 20 people and there's one person starts stirring something up like this, it's very easy for some to go along with it. But you've got to find the courage to stand up, and it does take courage. But the second thing I would say, and this is partly to do with pupils, students, and it's partly to do with schools and the curriculum, we have to do a lot more. And I know this is beginning to happen, and I know it does happen in schools, but we've got to have a greater honesty about the past and why there is all this a lot of particularly the racial prejudice and stereotypes that persist. And it does go back times of colonialism and empire, and we've got to learn about it. A couple of days ago, I was actually on in another discussion, which we won't have time today. Maybe we'll be able to explore this in more detail. But a lot of the racial ideas that led to the Holocaust, they weren't invented by the Nazis. This was part of a global idea, the race sciences, eugenics, and right here in the UK, in London, in some of our top universities, the development of the concepts of superior and inferior races were being developed at University College London. People like Carl Pearson were propagating all sorts of ideas, and these fed in to German academics who are working with them, that in turn fed into the Nazis. And so, we've got to be, often we look back, and it's right, we celebrate the sacrifices people made in defeating the Nazis in the Second World War and Britain and the Commonwealth. But, we need to go back a little bit further than that, and sometimes look at the difficult bits of history, because those bits, those ideas that fed in to cause the Holocaust and other genocides, they linger around, and they're in our literature, they're in the way I think, until we sort of dig them up and root them out. We're not going to be able to deal with this long-lasting prejudice. Sorry, I've gone a little bit off topic into the 19th century there, but it is absolutely relevant to what to the problems and challenges of today.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. And a question from me. Do you think that the prevention of future genocide lies with the education in the West or the education in the countries affected or recovering from the genocide? And what do you think needs to be prioritized?
Well, of course, it's very easy for me to say this, but both. But you are right. There needs to be education in both. I've spoken about how in Rwanda, the education there is helping to bring communities together. But equally, that kind of education can be developed, and Aegis Trust is involved in developing programs. In fact, from Rwanda, it's being developed in a country a little bit further north in Africa, but still in Central African Republic, another country that's one of the poorest countries in the world. And for the past 7 years, there's been a crisis there that's been suggested it's a religious conflict between Christians and Muslims, but it's more actually political in nature. And I think what we found is that it's possible to, even in the middle of a conflict and a crisis, to introduce education that can reduce the hostilities and help people to avoid being drawn into those kind of extremist violent groups with a certain degree of success. And the Rwandan educators developed in Rwanda are actually the ones that have been actually developing with Central Africans. So I think that's hugely important. We've seen that kind of peace and reconciliation education works to reduce violence. We've got evidence that it's helping deter people being drawn into violent militia that have been committing atrocities. However, if we don't have education in this country, I think there's two reasons why we need education about genocide and Holocaust in Western countries and in the UK. The first is just historical, that we actually have our own problems here. We have our own divisions in our own communities, and it's not that it's about to turn into genocide, but nonetheless, as we've, as Ari mentioned, there is a need for us to address prejudice and racism in our own communities. And I think the history of looking back at the history of genocide, going right back into empire and colonialism, can help that. But more importantly, it's important that we know about genocide, that because it's a problem in our world that our governments can do more to address. Why don't they do more? It's because they don't really think we're interested, and they don't think we care about it. So the only way that that's going to happen is if we understand it ourselves and understand what can be done and what ought to be done by governments, and to help put pressure on them. So that's why I think it needs to be both, because we often say, well, it's the United Nations that has to deal with that. Well, who at the United Nations is going to actually make decisions to help prevent or protect people? It's the Security Council. Who is the Security Council? Well, there's 5 permanent members of the Security Council. The United Kingdom is one of those permanent members. But if those, the Security Council was set up, as you know, at the end of the Second World War, with a purpose to maintain peace and security. Well, if preventing atrocities and genocide isn't about peace and security, then what is? And yet this is something that sort of goes under the radar, and there's all these different interests of nations, and we try to do as little as we can when these things are happening. So the only way to change that, I think, is by engaging with our members of Parliament, who in turn can engage with our government. And that's why I think education in the West is also really important.
Thank you, Doctor. We have some questions from the audience. This one's from Gracie and Jamie. Do you believe there is an ongoing genocide issue in China with the Uyghurs and other Muslims in Xinjiang? And then what do you think about the global response to the treatment of Uyghur Muslims?
Yeah, so this is a very good question. I mean, the evidence is that certainly, if it's not genocide, it's getting pretty close to it. And there is certainly a big danger. And I don't think, in some respects, we should get too hung up whether a court of law is going to define something as genocide or not. We know that terrible things are happening, people are being incarcerated, all sorts of horrific things are happening to the Uyghur population. The big question is, what can be done? We've already mentioned that about the Security Council is the body of the United Nations that should be maintaining peace and security, and therefore helping to prevent genocide. And those 5 permanent members have got a veto, including China. So if one of those countries is actually committing these atrocities, they're not going to allow any kind of intervention. And it's impossible to imagine that there can be any kind of intervention. However, in terms of the world response, what can happen is everybody trades with China, and the United States has done something I think that's very smart, in that they've passed some laws in which any goods that might be made from slave labor of the Uyghur population will be banned from import. Now, imagine if that happened everywhere in the world. This would start to have an economic impact, and it would mean that at least, of course, there could be an overriding ideological drive that a country like China could say, well, we don't really care about the economics of it, but at least it would be a way of engagement, and at least it's a way of us, everyone else around the world, saying, look, this is not acceptable in the 21st century. There have been some attempts actually in Parliament to do something similar in the UK that hasn't quite succeeded. But what we have found is that there have been a lot of cross-party interest. A recent bill nearly passed. It was short of 10 votes in the House of Commons, which shows that actually 10 people 10 more members of parliament could have made a difference there. So I think that in terms of what we can do, you know, you, for example, could get, keep connected with what's going on in Parliament through the Parliamentary Group on Genocide Prevention. And if there's a situation that needs a few more votes like this, writing to your MPs, contact your MPs could make all the difference to a situation that now, to a situation such as the response to the Uyghur. Now, does it mean that a law to stop imports from slave labor in this country will, prevent atrocities in China? Well, not by itself, no. But if enough countries start to make that position and that statement, it might be a way of curbing the situation, if not stopping it.
Thank you. Rebecca asks, what do you think can be done about Holocaust denial/denial of other mass genocides? Do you think this purposeful ignorance could make it easier for another atrocity like these to take place?
Yes, the reason Holocaust denial and genocide happens is that the people that perpetrate these crimes are trying to basically cover them up, and it's not that they say they didn't happen at all, but they try to diminish them and say, well, this was there was a terrorist situation, we're having to counter the terrorists, and or there was a civil war, and things happened on both sides, and that's just the way things happen. And so we've got to be clear, if there's going to be accountability for these kind of crimes, it's not, accountability isn't just about taking people to a court of law. It's also about cultural accountability, that we remember what happened. We remember the Holocaust, we remember what happened to the Armenians, we remember what happened into the Bosnian Muslims, where there's also a huge amount of denial going on about that, particularly in the former Yugoslavia. And we remember, why do we remember? Because we're going to learn, dive deep and learn the lessons from those situations. So we need to try and counter denial wherever we see it, whether it's a Holocaust or other genocides.
Another question from the audience. Sadaf is asking, looking back at the situation you said you found yourself in after the Bosnian conflict arose and the building of your centre, what would you do differently?
So I think that, this is something that we've been talking about with the new Holocaust Memorial that's been planned in London, that there needs to be ways in which to include other atrocities and other genocides. In the Genocide Memorial in Rwanda, there's a whole section on not just about the genocide that happened in Rwanda against the Tutsi, but other genocides as well. And I think that this is would be very good practice. In some respects, there needs to be, some kind of museum about, how atrocities happen. And I think that maybe, museums that of similar atrocities could link up more than they do as well, whether it's slavery, the Holocaust, but certainly, I think, if we wind back in time, we would find a way to look at the linkages, and indeed we are doing through programs looking at the linkages between different genocides. One of the ways in which we should do this as well, again, is going back and looking at empire. The whole situation in Bosnia was related to, the legacy of that was about empires, different empires, with the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman Empire linkages. The situation in Rwanda was a legacy of partly British Empire and German and Belgian Empire. So you have to go back, and that's one of the ways in which we can link all of these different genocides.
Thank you. We have one more question from the audience, from Jamie again. How has your role as a doctor shifted your perspective in what you have witnessed, if at all?
So certainly, I've had I don't know whether it's a privilege, but I've been in a situation where I've traveled around different parts of the world, whether it's in Rwanda, Central African Republic, Darfur and Sudan, different parts of the Middle East, talking to refugees that are fleeing atrocities. And I think, you know, my experience as a doctor has coloured it, has shaped the way in which I see these events, because just in the same way that, you know, I said at the beginning, whether it's preventing heart disease or cancer, you've got to get to the root of the problem, look at the risk factors and deal with risk factors, rather than always leaving it to the very end. You don't wait until, you know, cancer's reached stage 4 and spread all around the body to try and, you know, do aggressive surgery. You know, we have programs to research about this, so we can find it early, screen for it, treat it at the earliest possible stage, and we invest huge amount of resources to do that. Now, if we're able to apply that concept to medical problems, we should just be able to apply that to, you know, the problems that human beings create in their own communities and their own societies, and understand what those risk factors are, and deal with it at a much earlier stage. So yeah, it's certainly shaped the way in which I see these crises.
And I think we have one final question from the audience. What is it exactly, Gracie asked, what is it exactly that your centre does now to try to tackle ongoing genocide in the world?
Yeah, so I think we're probably not going to have time to show this, but we did have a 2-minute clip from somebody in Central African Republic, one of my colleagues there, and I mentioned that what we do is we work with communities. By the way, when we work with communities that come to us, we don't sort of parachute in looking for places where there's conflict. But if people where there is come to Rwanda or to the UK and say, well, we want to try and apply some of this preventative education work in our communities, and we'll try and develop a program. One of the places where that's working at the moment is in the Central African Republic. What I might do is ask Katie if she could put the video up onto the website, thinking about website, so that you can see the message from, I got thumbs up from Katie, see the message that was actually sent to us from my colleague in Central African Republic, because although we've had this education program for the past 7 years there, in the past month, actually in the run up to the elections in December, there was a new rebellion, and there's an attempted coup to overthrow the current government. The capital city Bangui is surrounded by rebels at the moment, and they've cut the food supply off to the capital city Bangui. Now, what's happening there is then, you know, when people are hungry, they're not interested in talking about peace and peace education. They're trying to feed their families, and young people, when I say young people, this is young people like your age, are being drawn into militias. They're being, you know, they get attracted by the guns because they're going to, you know, from that they then get food to feed their families. And so what we're looking to do at the moment, even the communities where we're working, we're talking with other aid agencies, but there is a connection between hunger and violence. So this moves up, you know, we talk about primary prevention is when we're dealing with the risk factors. Now this is moving into a situation where at secondary prevention, there is a crisis, we've got to respond to it. And so we're putting a small campaign together to help bring some aid to the communities that we're working with. Now, what I'm just going to say is a little bit complicated, not complicated, it's actually quite simple. We're not simply there bringing in food. The idea isn't that we just fly in food. There's lots of other agencies that do that when people are starving, the World Food Programme and lots of NGOs. What we're trying to do is say, well, all the roads to the capital city are blocked. It's going to create even greater conflict because of the tension that's there. What we need to do is help the traders. There's already markets, places there, just like anywhere in the country. If we can somehow break that blockade by flying food in, not to distribute food, but to basically provide a form of transport so that traders can buy food from the local countries, they can keep the markets going, because at the moment prices are escalating. You know, to buy an egg, it's like half a day's salary at the moment for your family. So this is a very practical way in which we're responding to a crisis in a sort of quite an innovative way. Anyway, but you can see that, so like a 2.5 minute message that my colleague Alan has sent from Central African Republic, and he will also refer to the work we're doing with the faith leaders there, the education programs and the food delivery going to the faith leaders. They are, both the Catholic, Protestant and Muslim leaders are just absolutely incredible there, and they're doing everything they can. We always hear bad news about religion, but they're really trying to bring people together, and Aegis Trust is supporting them in every way that we can. So that's a very practical way in which we're trying to help prevent atrocities today in the Central African Republic, and it's something that you too could become involved in.
Thank you. That brings the Q&A to a close. Thank you to Dr. Spence, Dr. James, Ms. Beretta, the rest of our student team, and any other organisers for helping to put this all together. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope that you will really take what Dr. James has said into account into your day-to-day lives. Over to Amjad to...
And Ori, I don't mean to interrupt your great close, but Amjad and Ori and Matt, before you go, one other thing I could send to Katie to send up to the website is a place where you can express your support for the parliamentarians, to encourage parliamentarians to get involved in genocide prevention. And so, I tell you from firsthand experience, it makes a huge difference when they hear from you. So if you wish to sign up to it, and then you can get like monthly newsletters, direct from Parliament, and Aegis Trust is helping to sort of coordinate some of that, but it would help a sort of flow of information. In return, you can help to lobby your MPs.
Thank you for that. I think Amjad is going to announce the next talk in this series.
Hi guys, just a reminder that this Thinking About series is a weekly event, and the next talk will be featuring David Lammy, who will be discussing the idea of identity. And I think just to end, I would like to quote Dr. Smith, and I think it's very provocative, and it definitely needs some time to be taken away and processed. And it says, if we can eradicate smallpox, put men on the moon, and decipher the human genome, surely we can learn to stop killing each other. Thank you, everyone.